Of all the punishments for winning a war, a scholarship was by far the most insulting. Ray Mercer stood in the center of her new dorm room at the prestigious Unity Academy, a black smudge of defiance in a universe of sterile white. Her duffel bag, slumped by the door like a defeated soldier, was the only object in the room that had any personality. And most of it was grime. The air smelled of recycled perfection. It was the kind of clean that felt aggressive, like it was actively trying to scrub the life out of you. She kicked off her scuffed combat boots, which landed with a satisfyingly disruptive thud, and ran a hand through her choppy, ink-black hair. Chipped nail polish, also black, caught the sharp, clinical light. A hero's welcome, they called it, a chance to build bridges. It felt more like being put on a display case, labeled Humanity's Tamed Monster. The door slid open with a whisper-quiet hiss. He was tall, elegant, and moved with a grace that seemed to defy the normal rules of friction. His uniform was a work of art, all sharp lines and silver piping, tailored to a body engineered for excellence. His skin possessed a faint, steady glow, a soft, pearlescent light that seemed to emanate from within, casting his chiseled features in a celestial light. Ray's blood went cold. She knew that face. She'd seen it in intelligence briefings, a younger version, staring out from a family portrait beside his father. He stopped just inside the doorway, his eyes a shade of startling luminous violet, sweeping the room. They took in the pristine bed, the empty desk, her duffel bag, and finally, her. The recognition was instantaneous. His perfect posture tightened by a fraction of a degree. The faint light from his skin didn't flicker, didn't change, but the atmosphere in the room went from sterile to cryogenic. "You," he said. The word wasn't an accusation, it was a verdict. Ray offered him a lazy, insolent smirk. "Me." He stepped fully into the room, his presence consuming the sterile space. "Theron Tarvok," he stated, his voice a low, resonant baritone, smooth as polished stone and just as cold. "Ray Mercer," she shot back, matching his formality with pure spite. "Guess we're roommates." Theron's gaze was analytical, dissecting her. "They told me I'd be rooming with the human war hero. They failed to mention it was the savage responsible for my father's death." The air crackled. She'd crushed his father's fleet. Now, she was sharing a dorm with their commander's son. Perfect. Just perfect. Ray's smirk didn't waver, but it became a shield. "Your father was the commander of a warship pointing its guns at my home. I was the one who survived." Theron's jaw tightened. The muscle there was the only sign of the fury churning beneath his disciplined surface. "You speak of survival as if it is a virtue in itself. My father, High Commander Tavok, dedicated his life to the principles of strategy, discipline, and honor. His death was the result of a chaotic, unpredictable gambit, a brute force throw of cosmic dice by a desperate pilot in a tin can." "Hey, it was a very nice tin can," Ray said, her voice dripping with false cheer. "And the dice came up in my favor. Tough break for him." "Your species mistakes a lack of foresight for improvisation," Theron said, his voice dropping lower, each word a carefully placed shard of ice. "A distinction you seem unable to grasp. Your victory was a statistical anomaly, a variable so random, so devoid of logic, that our systems, which are designed to counter strategy, could not account for it. You are merely a statistical anomaly, a bug in the galactic code." and glad I could crash your system," Ray replied, her dark eyes glinting. She gestured vaguely at the empty side of the room. "Welcome to the doghouse, Remy. Try not to get your perfection all over my side." He didn't reply. He simply turned, retrieved a single perfectly symmetrical silver case from the hall, and began to unpack, his movements exact and deliberate, both fascinating and infuriating to watch. Every item had its place. Every movement was economical and direct. It was the polar opposite of her own chaotic existence. The war might be over, but for Ray Mercer and Theron Tuvok, it had just moved into a much, much smaller room.
"The objective of this midterm exercise,"
Instructor Boral's voice boomed across the simulation chamber,
"is to subdue a rogue target. Subdue, not obliterate, not maim, not creatively dismember. This is a test of controlled application of force and adherence to established coalition procedures. Finesse over force."
Boral was a Vadron, a species that looked like a mountain range that had decided to get up and start teaching combat theory. He was massive, his skin the color and texture of weathered granite, and his face was set in a permanent expression of grim disapproval. He gestured a thick, four-fingered hand toward the center of the training room, where a heavily armored combat drone stood waiting.
"Cadet Tuvok," Boral grunted. "You're first."
Theron strode onto the floor, a standard-issue neural stunner held in a perfect two-handed grip. The drone's optical sensors glowed red, and it charged. The engagement was less a fight and more a dance. Theron moved with his signature inhuman grace. He didn't meet the drone's charge head-on. He pivoted, using the machine's momentum against it. His every step a calculated angle. He sidestepped a piston-driven punch, flowed under a sweeping leg, and with 3 economical shots from the stunner, struck the drone's primary motor joints in its knees and shoulder. The drone seized, sparks fizzing from its deactivated limbs, and toppled onto the mat with a heavy clang. The entire engagement lasted 12 seconds.
"Textbook execution,"
Boral said, and for the Vadron, it was the equivalent of a standing ovation.
"Observe, class. Economy of motion, tactical patience, exploitation of structural weakness. That is how a professional operates. Excellent, Cadet Tuvok."
Theron gave a curt, respectful nod and returned to the line. His luminous eyes met Ray's for a fraction of a second, his expression unreadable, but deeply self-satisfied.
"Cadet Mercer,"
Boral called, and the name sounded like a curse on his lips.
"Your turn."
Ray sauntered onto the floor, swinging her own stunner loosely in one hand like a cheap toy. She took one look at the reset, fully functional drone and sighed. Protocol was boring. Finesse was for people who had time to practice it. She'd learned to fight in the back alleys of orbital dockyards, where winning was all that mattered and style points got you shivved at best. The drone charged. Ray didn't dance. She didn't pivot. She stood her ground until the last possible second, then threw herself into a clumsy but effective sideways roll. The drone's fist hammered the floor where she had been, cracking the polymer mat. As she came up, she didn't aim for the joints. She aimed for a small, innocuous panel on the ceiling directly above the drone. She fired once. The shot, a pulse of concentrated energy, struck a red conduit box labeled Emergency Fire Suppression. A split second later, the entire chamber was drenched in a torrent of conductive foam. It rained down thick and sludgy, shorting out the lights, and the air grew thick with the smell of burnt chemicals. The drone, caught in the downpour, seized violently. Its optical sensors flickered from red to dead. Its limbs locked, and it stood frozen for a moment before its internal power systems fried with a loud pop. It collapsed in a heap, smoking slightly in the deluge. Silence, broken only by the hiss of the foam. Ray stood there, dripping, and gave the deactivated drone a little kick. Subdued. From the observation deck, she could feel Boral's fury radiating like heat from an engine core. The emergency lights flickered on, casting long, distorted shadows. Theron was there, staring, his face a mask of cold disbelief. His internal monologue, Ray imagined, was probably having an aneurysm trying to categorize her actions. He saw brutishness, inefficiency, a flagrant disregard for the elegant solution. She saw a problem that was no longer a problem.
Mercer!
Burl's roar finally broke the silence. He descended the steps to the floor, his heavy footfalls shaking the chamber.
What in the name of the silent architects was that?
That was me subduing the target, Ray said, wiping foam from her face. You said finesse over force. Didn't say force wasn't an option.
You ignored procedure. You disregarded every tactical regulation. You triggered a Class 4 hazardous material cleanup to win a simple training exercise.
He bellowed, his face inches from hers.
Cadet, this is an institution of discipline, not a brawl in your mudball world. Your approach is a blunt instrument for a blunt mind.
The instrument might be blunt, Ray muttered, but the nail's flat. Boral's eyes narrowed into slits.
Failing grade, Mercer. See me after class for your demerit citation and cleaning detail assignment. Get off my training floor.
As she walked past the line of her stunned classmates, she caught Theron's eye again. This time, there was no satisfaction in his gaze, only a profound, chilling certainty. He saw her as the embodiment of the chaos that had killed his father. And in that moment, she had done absolutely nothing to prove him wrong. The Great Refectory of Unity Academy was a testament to interspecies culinary diplomacy. Hundreds of food synthesizers lined the walls, each capable of producing the nutritionally perfect and culturally appropriate meal for any of the 73 species enrolled. Usually. Today, every single synthesizer, from the Auranian protein vast to the Glyptodon mineral licks, was dispensing the same thing: a foul, lukewarm gray nutrient paste. It had the consistency of industrial sludge and smelled vaguely of despair and boiled cabbage. A low grumble of discontent rippled through the massive hall. Ray, who had been looking forward to a halfway decent synthesized cheeseburger, stared at the glob of gray misery on her tray with utter disgust.
What is this stuff?
A forearmed Jelna student next to her chirped, poking it with a curious digit. That, Ray said, is what happens when a machine loses the will to live. Within the hour, Academy security had cordoned off the refectory. An inquiry was launched. The culprit was found with alarming speed. The malicious command, a system-wide override that defaulted all synthesizers to Emergency Ration Omega, had been routed through a public terminal session, a session that had been authenticated with Ray Mercer's credentials. She was summoned to a small, windowless office to face a blandly severe administrative officer.
The logs are quite clear, Cadet Mercer,
the officer said, her voice devoid of emotion.
The command was executed from Terminal 7 at 12:17 Standard Time. Our records show you accessed the same terminal at 12:15 to look up the daily menu.
I looked up the menu, saw the burger, and left,
Ray protested, leaning forward in her chair.
I was there for 30 seconds tops.
The saboteur, it seems, was clever,
the officer continued, completely ignoring her.
They simply use your own active authenticated session to mask their access signature. To the system, the command to dispense nutrient paste appears to have originated from you.
So I'm being framed, You are being held responsible for a breach that occurred using your credentials, the officer corrected. It is your duty to ensure your session is properly terminated. You have no way to prove you didn't input the command yourself. You will be issued a formal demerit. Another incident of this nature will result in more severe consequences. She was dismissed. As she walked out of the office, fuming, she saw Theron standing down the hall, watching her. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't even angry. He was just observing. His face held the calm, dispassionate expression of a scientist watching a hypothesis be proven correct. She was chaos, and chaos, it seemed, was contagious. He turned and walked away without a word, his silence a more potent accusation than any shout. The Xenobotany Arboretum was Theron's sanctuary, a vast, domed chamber filled with priceless, delicate flora from 1,000 worlds. It was a monument to order, balance, and controlled growth. The air was a rich tapestry of chlorophyll and alien pollen, a stark contrast to the sterile corridors of the rest of the station, which was why the screech of the environmental alarms was so jarring. Red lights flashed across the dome and automated shutters began to descend, plunging the carefully calibrated ecosystems into chaos. The humidity spiked, then plummeted. The temperature fluctuated wildly. A rare grove of silicon-based flowers, their petals like sheets of obsidian, from the TRAPPIST-1 systems began to fracture the sound like tiny bells shattering. This time, the investigation was faster, and the verdict more damning. The sabotage command was more sophisticated, layered within the data stream of a botanical study file, a file on SETI Alpha 5's carnivorous fungi that Ray had downloaded for a botany elective she was barely passing. To the investigators, it was a cunning, sophisticated act of digital vandalism. The evidence was circumstantial but tight. Who else but the chaotic human with a history of disregarding systems would download a file on meat-eating mushrooms and then, moments later, nearly destroy the Arboretum? She was placed on academic probation and confined to her quarters until further notice. The news spread through the academy like a virus. She was no longer just the chaotic war hero. She was a saboteur, a menace. The confrontation she'd been expecting finally came. Theron cornered her in the corridor just outside their dorm room, his face a storm of controlled fury. The faint light of his skin seemed brighter, harsher. "Must you vandalize everything you touch?" he demanded, his voice low and shaking with rage. "My father's honor, the Academy's refectory. Now this, a place of peace, of life? Was your victory at the Crimson Nebula not enough destruction for you?" Ray's own anger, born of frustration and injustice, flared to meet his. He saw the Arboretum. She saw another gilded cage she was being blamed for rattling. "Oh, I'm sorry," she snapped back, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Didn't mean to mess up your perfectly curated existence with, reality. Not all of us grew up in a sterile biodome, Tuvok. Where I'm from, things break. Things get messy. Sometimes you have to blow up the fire suppression system to get the job done." "That is the exact sentiment that proves my point." He shot back, taking a step closer. Students passing in the halls slowed, watching the drama unfold. "You celebrate entropy. You see a complex, beautiful system, and your only instinct is to see how it shatters. And you see a human being, and your only instinct is to blame her for your father getting himself killed." The blow landed. For a second, the discipline in his face cracked, revealing a raw, profound grief. The anger was a shield for his pain, and she had just punched right through it. The violet of his eyes seemed to darken. He straightened up,
the mask of cold fury slamming back into place.
Stay away from me, Mercer. Stay away from everything.
He turned and strode into the room, the door sliding shut behind him. The argument had been bitter, public, and had solved nothing. It had only carved the chasm between them deeper. A suffocating silence became their third roommate. Confined to quarters, Ray and Theron coexisted in a state of meticulously maintained Cold War. They divided the room with an invisible line. Her side was a growing pile of discarded clothes, data slates with cracked screens, and dog-eared paper books she had had shipped from home. His side remained a bastion of minimalist order, as if he could ward off her chaotic influence through sheer force of will and tidiness. They didn't speak. They didn't acknowledge each other. They moved around one another like planets locked in a deeply resentful orbit. The only sounds were the rustle of pages as Ray read, the soft chime of Theron's data slate as he studied, and the whisper of the air filtration system. The Academy had cut off her mess privileges, so Ray survived on a stash of contraband instant noodles she had smuggled in. One evening, the smell of artificial chicken broth and rehydrated vegetables filled the sterile air. It was a scent of home, of cheap, honest survival, and in the pristine environment of the room, it was as loud as a gunshot. Theron, seated at his desk, paused his work. He didn't turn, but Ray could see his reflection in the dark screen of his monitor. His analytical gaze was fixed on her as she stirred the steaming cup with a disposable spork. He watched the process with a kind of horrified clinical detachment, as if she were handling a biohazard. He was probably cataloging the absurd number of chemical preservatives listed in the ingredients, calculating their long-term effects on the human digestive system. Ray took a defiant slurp, the sound echoing in the oppressive quiet. She met his reflected gaze and held it. He looked away first, returning to his schematics. They didn't speak, but the message was clear. Her very existence, her food, her mess, her unpredictable nature was an offense to his ordered world. And his silent, constant judgment was a weight on her shoulders, a reminder that in this perfect gilded cage, she would always be the creature that didn't belong. The Academy's transit pod network, a marvel of Aethel engineering that whisked students across the vast expanse of the Aethelgard station, shut down, abruptly, catastrophically. One moment, hundreds of pods were gliding along their magnetic tracks. The next, they were all dead, stranding students and faculty mid-transit. Emergency klaxons blared through the station as a power failure on one of the main trunk lines caused a cascading system crash. It was the most significant infrastructure failure in the Academy's history. The accusation against Ray was practically pre-written. Security forces were on their way to her dorm to place her in formal custody. The official report already citing her as the prime suspect in an act of large-scale sabotage. But then the report fell apart. The system failure was traced to a precise microsecond, 1947:03 Standard Time, a single malicious surge directed at a key power conduit. It was a ghost in the machine, untraceable, except for one inconvenient fact. At 1947:03, Ray Mercer and Theron Tuvok were not sitting in a resentful silence. They were, for the first time in days, speaking, or rather, screaming. The argument had started over something trivial. Ray had accidentally knocked one of Theron's perfectly aligned study crystals onto the floor, and had escalated with breathtaking speed into a full-throated shouting match about everything from her taste in music to his species' penchant for genetic arrogance. It was so loud that multiple students on their residential floor had filed noise complaints. 2 resident assistants and a junior proctor had been standing outside their door debating how to intervene when the station-wide alarms went off. They were witnesses, unimpeachable witnesses. Ray Mercer had an airtight alibi, and Theron Tavak, infuriatingly, was it. The security chief, a stout Tellarite with drooping jowls, reviewed the witness statements in their dorm room, his expression a mixture of frustration and bafflement.
So let me get this straight,
The chief grumbled, looking from Ray to Theron.
At the exact moment the transit grid was sabotaged, you two were arguing.
He started it.
Ray muttered, crossing her arms.
Your lack of spatial awareness is not my responsibility.
Theron retorted, his voice clipped.
It was a rock! A shiny, useless rock! It was a mnemonic crystal containing 4th dimension calculus theorems! Enough!
The chief barked, rubbing his temples.
The point is, you were both here. You were both seen. And you were both heard loudly.
He sighed, a weary, rattling sound.
Cadet Mercer, you're cleared of this one. The timing rules you out.
He and his team left, leaving Ray and Theron alone again in the sudden quiet. The silence that returned was different. It was no longer a heavy blanket of mutual disdain. It was something thinner, laced with confusion. Ray was cleared, but her reputation was in ruins. And Theron looked deeply, profoundly unsettled. His entire worldview was built on verifiable data, on patterns and logic, and for the first time, the facts did not align. The chaos had a source, but it wasn't Ray. And for a mind like his, an unsolved logical discrepancy was a wound that could not be ignored. For 2 full days, Theron was quiet. He didn't study, he didn't clean, he just sat at his desk staring at a blank data slate, the faint light of his skin the only illumination on his side of the room. Ray watched him out of the corner of her eye, a strange sense of anticipation building. He was processing, running the data through that magnificent, ordered brain of his. On the 3rd day, he finally spoke. "The nutrient paste incident," he said, not looking at her. His voice was flat, analytical. "The saboteur piggybacked on your authenticated session. A simple but effective method of misdirection." Ray waited, saying nothing. "The Arboretum," he continued. "The malicious code was embedded in a data file you downloaded. More sophisticated. It required foreknowledge of your actions. Perpetrator knew you would access that specific file." "Your point?" Ray asked, her tone wary. "The transit grid shut down. An expert-level system attack. But you are here. The data is irrefutable. You are innocent of that specific charge." He finally turned to face her, his luminous violet eyes intense. "While your presence at the Academy correlates too strongly with these events for me to consider you innocent, I must concede you're not the direct agent of them all. The data is corrupted." Ray almost laughed. He wasn't saying he believed her. He was saying he believed the numbers, and the numbers had finally stopped pointing in her direction. "There is a logical discrepancy," Theron stated, standing up. "A missing variable. The incidents are escalating in technical complexity. This suggests an actor with a high degree of system knowledge, not the random vandalism of a disgruntled student." He paced the small space between their beds, his movements precise, even in his agitation. "They are framing you,
deliberately. They are using your reputation for chaos as a smokescreen for their own systematic actions. This is an affront to reason. It must be solved." Ray raised an eyebrow. "And how do you plan on doing that? The entire academy thinks I'm a one-woman wrecking crew." He stopped and looked at her, his expression a mixture of distaste and grim necessity. "You possess a unique perspective, unconventional. You notice things that a disciplined mind might dismiss as irrelevant noise. I possess the analytical framework to interpret those findings." He took a breath, as if the words themselves were physically painful to speak. "I propose a joint investigation." Ray stared at him. This wasn't an olive branch. He wasn't trying to help her. He was trying to fix a broken equation that offended his sensibilities. But he was also her only way out. Everyone else had already convicted her. "Why?" she asked, genuinely curious. "Why help me?" "Do not mistake my intentions. I am not helping you," he corrected her instantly. "I am restoring order to a chaotic situation. The truth is a non-negotiable asset, and right now, it is missing." He extended a hand. It was a formal gesture, not a friendly one. "Do we have an accord?" Ray looked at his outstretched hand, then at his deadly serious face. She was alone, on probation, and one step away from being expelled from the only place that could clear her name. He was arrogant, cold, and probably still hated her guts. But he was also brilliant, and for the first time, he was on her side. Sort of. Seeing no other choice, she slapped her hand into his. His grip was firm, cool. "Fine, Tavok. We have an accord. But if you try to organize my bookshelf, the deal is off." A flicker of something, humor, maybe, crossed his face before his mask of neutrality returned. "Acceptable terms."
The Academy archives were a digital fortress, a labyrinth of firewalls and encryption safeguards. Theron navigated them with an expert's ease, dismantling firewalls and unspooling encryption with a few quiet commands, pulling up official schematics of the station's power grids and security networks. He laid them out as holographic projections in their room, creating a dizzying web of blue light. The refractory synthesizers, the arboretum atmospherics, and the transit power conduit. He murmured, tracing lines in the air with a glowing finger. On the surface, they are entirely separate systems, running on independent networks. There is no logical connection. Ray leaned against her bunk, bored. Watching Theron comb through the official plans was putting her to sleep. He was looking at the station as it was supposed to be. She always found it more useful to look for the cracks, the forgotten bits and pieces that designers and engineers left behind. "Are there any old files?" she asked, picking at a loose thread on her sleeve. "Like from before the last big system upgrade, decommissioned stuff." Theron paused, his brow furrowed. "Why would we examine obsolete data?" "Because people are lazy," Ray said simply. "When they build something new, they don't always rip out the old wiring. They just build on top of it. It's a scavenger's trick. You look for the junk nobody else wants." He considered this for a moment. It was an illogical, inefficient approach, but their current logical approach was yielding nothing. With a sigh of concession, he adjusted his search parameters, digging deep into the station's foundational code back to its original construction. He found it almost immediately, a series of references buried under layers of outdated security measures to something called legacy conduits. "What is this?" he whispered, his eyes wide with discovery. He brought up a new schematic. It was older, cruder. It showed a secondary power grid, a network of thick cables that snaked through the station's deepest, most inaccessible maintenance corridors. A forgotten skeleton inside the station's modern body. In all three sabotage systems, the refectory, the arboretum, and the transit grid, were connected to it. Ray breathed, pushing off her bunk to get a closer look. "They're all wired into this old grid."
It's a redundant power system from the station's initial construction phase. Theron analyzed. His fingers moved swiftly across his console, issuing a flurry of commands. It was deemed inefficient and scheduled for removal, but the work was never completed. It's not on any modern schematic. He tried to access the logs for the conduits. Access denied. The logs are scrubbed, wiped clean. Nothing is ever really wiped, Ray said, leaning over his shoulder. False hardware diagnostic. Don't ask for the log file. Ask the conduit itself if it's feeling okay. Sometimes you get an error message with a data fragment attached. Theron's fingers stilled. It was another crude backdoor approach, a digital version of kicking the machine to see what falls out. With visible reluctance, he typed in the command. The system fought back, throwing up error messages, but then, for a split second, a diagnostic report flashed on the screen before being erased. It was a string of corrupted data, mostly garbage. But at the end of it, clear as day, was a fragment, a piece of command authorization code. And it was written in the unmistakable, blocky syntax of the veteran military.
For this exercise, you will be paired.
Instructor Boral announced, his granite-like face unreadable.
The objective is two-person infiltration of a hostile command center. One operative provides cover and overwatch, while the other retrieves the data core. Teamwork is paramount.
He began reading the pairings. Ray's stomach tightened. She knew what was coming.
Cadet Tavok and Cadet Mercer.
Of course. The simulation began. They were plunged into a virtual war zone, the air thick with fake smoke and the sound of holographic gunfire. Theron predictably took the lead, moving with fluid efficiency, calling out enemy positions in a calm, clipped monotone. Ray followed, providing cover fire. Her movements more reactive, less polished, but just as deadly. For a few minutes, they were a surprisingly effective team. The chaos of her improvisation meshed with the solid structure of his tactics. They reached the final obstacle, a corridor crisscrossed with a dense grid of security lasers. Standard activation sequence is Alpha Gamma Niner, Theron said, crouching behind a barricade. I will input the code. Cover me.
Got it.
Ray replied, scanning the approach. As Theron began to work on a nearby terminal, a high-pitched whine filled the air. Ray glanced at the laser grid. One of the emitters was glowing brighter than the others, its beam shifting from a harmless red simulation light to a searing white-hot intensity. The air around it distorted with a heat haze. The safety limiters had failed. That was no longer a simulation laser. It was real, and it was aimed directly at her. Time seemed to slow down. The beam fired.
Ray!
It was the first time he'd used her name. Theron wasn't looking at the terminal anymore. He was looking at her, his violet eyes wide with alarm. He didn't hesitate. He didn't calculate. He reacted. He launched himself across the space between them, shoving her hard. The world was a blur of motion and searing pain in her shoulder as the beam grazed her, vaporizing a patch of her uniform and scoring a deep, black burn into the wall behind her. She hit the floor hard, Theron landing beside her.
Emergency shutdown command. Tavok Theron ID 734 Alpha. Abort simulation. Abort!
He yelled, his voice ringing in an authority she'd never heard from him before. The simulation instantly vanished. The lights came up, revealing the scorched wall and the acrid smell of superheated metal and burnt polymer. Boral strode onto the floor, his expression one of mild annoyance.
A system glitch,
He declared, looking at the fused laser emitter.
Unfortunate, but these things happen with older equipment. Medical team to the training floor.
As the medtech rushed over to treat her shoulder, Ray locked eyes with Theron. They both knew. That wasn't a glitch. The timing was too perfect. The target was too precise. That was an assassination attempt. And Instructor Boral, their prime suspect, had just tried to eliminate one of its investigators. A generic Vedron command code is useless, Theron stated, pacing their room.
The burn on Ray's shoulder was bandage, a dull, throbbing reminder of how close she'd come. There are thousands of Vedron personnel on the station. It could be anyone. We need specific access logs, Ray said, wincing as she shifted her weight. We need to know which Vedron has been poking around the legacy conduits. That data is classified, restricted to the Atheo archivist. They will not grant access to a human, especially one with your reputation. So you asked them, Ray said. You're Mr. Perfect Blueblood, son of the big shot commander. They'll roll out the red carpet for you. Theron looked doubtful, but he agreed. It was the most logical path. The Aethel student archives were located in a pristine, silent wing of the library. It was staffed by a trio of Aethel scions who looked even more arrogant and genetically perfected than Theron, if such a thing could exist. They regarded Theron with cool respect, but when they saw Ray lurking behind him, their faint inner glow seemed to dim with disdain. Theron made his requests. He was polite, logical, and firm, explaining his need for station infrastructure logs for a research project on power grid efficiency. He was stonewalled. I'm sorry, Cadet Tavok, the lead archivist said, his voice smooth and condescending. Access to foundational construction logs is restricted to level prime clearance. A student project does not meet the criteria, regardless of your family name. It is a matter of station security, Theron pressed. Then you should take it up with station security. The archivist replied with an air of finality and turned back to his console. Theron stood there, his jaw tight with frustration. His entire life, his name and his logic had opened every door. For the first time, they had failed. Ray sighed. Okay, my turn. She pushed past him and sauntered up to the desk, leaning on it with a casualness that made the archivist flinch. She gave them her best, most unhinged grin. Listen, fellas, she said, her voice low and conspiratorial. Let's cut the crap. I know things. The archivist stared at her, bewildered. Things about perfection. She continued, tapping a black-nailed finger on the desk. Things about perfect genetic lineages. You know, how sometimes the data doesn't quite match the family tree. A little blip here, a recessive gene there that isn't supposed to be. I spent a lot of time in the dirty parts of the network. It's amazing what you find in old medical records. It would be a shame if some of that data got chaotic. It was pure, unadulterated bluff. She had nothing, but she was playing up her reputation as the crazy human who breaks things, and she was aiming it squarely at the biggest cultural insecurity, their obsession with genetic purity. The three Aethel looked at each other, their perfect faces pale. The lead archivist swallowed hard. Without another word, he slid a secure data slate across the desk. The logs you requested. Please, be discreet. Always am, Ray said with a wink. She snatched the slate and turned to leave. Theron was staring at her, his expression a chaotic mix of appalled horror and grudging admiration. That was, he started, struggling for the right word. Effective? Ray supplied, grinning. Unorthodox. He finally settled on, a muscle twitching in his cheek, and deeply unsettling. Yeah, well, Ray said, patting the data slate. Welcome to the real world, Tavok. Sometimes you gotta kick the anthill to get the honey. He didn't have a response for that. Back in the dorm, the data slate was a treasure trove. Theron plugged it into his console, and the restricted construction records of Aethelgard Station filled their holographic display. Now, he said, his attention narrowed to a single point. We cross-referenced the user access logs for legacy conduits with the master roster of the veteran personnel on this station. Lines of code scrolled past. The system sifted through terabytes of data, searching for the single point of intersection. Ray watched over his shoulder, the throb in her own shoulder, a distant hum beneath the thrill of the hunt. This was it, the final piece. The system chimed. A single profile was isolated on the screen.
User ID, Boral V Instructor, Applied Combat Studies. Access History, Refractory Power Conduit 7B, Xenobotany Atmospheric Relay 4, Transit Grid Primary Power Junction, Architect Failsafe Core Chamber Sublevel 9. A horrifying picture snapped into focus. The so-called pranks were a sequential power-up routine. Boral had been using the sabotage systems to divert massive amounts of energy step by step through the Forgotten Legacy conduits. It was a slow, step-by-step process hidden in plain sight, each incident dismissed as an act of random vandalism by a chaotic human. And the circuit had a destination. The conduits all terminated in one place, deep in the station's belly. "The architect fell safe," Theron whispered, his voice laced with dread. He brought up a restricted schematic from the slate. It showed a colossal spherical device at the heart of the station's oldest section, the stasis engine. "He's been preparing it," Ray said, her blood running cold. "The pranks, the accidents, it was all a smokescreen to get the engine ready for activation." The final log entry blinked on the screen. It was time-stamped just minutes ago. User Boral V. Action: Initiate final power cascade. Location: Stasis engine core chamber. "He's activating it," Theron said, his face grim. "Right now." The maintenance sub-levels were a world away from the polished perfection of the Academy. It was a labyrinth of rusting catwalks, hissing pipes, and the groaning thrum of ancient machinery. The air was thick with the coppery smell of electricity and hot metal. "So, what's the plan?" Ray asked, jogging to keep up with Theron's long, purposeful strides. "The plan is to access the engine's control interface and execute an emergency shutdown," he said, his voice tight. "Failing that, we sever the primary power conduits." "Right. Logical. What if Boral's waiting for us and tries to turn us into charcoal briquettes again?" "That is an unwelcome but predictable variable," Theron replied without breaking stride. "I will engage him. You will focus on the console." They found him in a vast, circular chamber at the very heart of the station. The room was cold, the air humming with an almost unbearable amount of power. In the center, suspended by massive energy pylons, was the stasis engine. It was a colossal sphere of interlocking, shifting metal plates, its surface etched with glowing circuits that pulsed with a sickening green light. Instructor Boral stood on a raised platform before a control console, his hulking form silhouetted against the engine's glow. He turned as they entered, and his face was not that of a madman. It was serene, filled with a chilling, righteous conviction. The air around him shimmered, warped by the energy field emanating from the nearly active device.
"I knew you would figure it out, cadets."
Boral's voice boomed, amplified by the chamber's acoustics.
"Tuvok, your logic is undeniable. And Mercer, your chaos is a powerful, if crude, analytical tool."
"Shut it down, Boral," Theron commanded, raising his stunner. "It's over." Boral laughed a deep, rumbling sound.
Over. It's just beginning. For millennia, the Vedran have stood by and watched the galaxy rot. We were keepers of order, the shepherds of Architect's great plan. But we have forgotten our purpose, grown complacent while lesser species, like humanity, splash their chaotic, unpredictable filth across the stars.
He spread his arms wide, a zealot in the light of his god.
I alone remember our sacred duty. The stasis engine will not destroy. It will correct. It will broadcast a field that will strip away the excess. the radical free will, the pointless aggression. It will restore a proper, stable order to a galaxy that has lost its way.
He slammed a fist down on the console.
And humanity will be the first to be cured.
The hum of the engine rose to a deafening roar. The green light intensified, and Ray felt a strange pressure in her mind, a smoothing out of her thoughts, a desire for quiet, for simplicity, for order. The field washed over them. Ray felt her anger, her fear, her very personality being sanded down, replaced by a calm, placid acceptance. Boral, augmented by the engine's power, was a juggernaut. He moved with a speed that defied his bulk, swatting Theron's stunner blast aside as if they were insects.
Your aggression is illogical, Cadet Tuvok,
Boral bellowed, advancing on them. Theron, fighting the mental pressure, scrambled to a secondary console. His fingers moved swiftly over the keypad.
Emergency shutdown codes are locked out.
He's rewritten the root permissions. Boral backhanded Theron across the chamber, sending him crashing into a bank of computers. The Aethel slumped to the ground, stunned. The engine's roar was climbing in pitch, reaching its final activation frequency. The pressure in Ray's head was immense. Just let it happen, a placid voice in her mind whispered. It's easier. No more conflict. No more chaos. Chaos. The word cut through the fog. Her chaos. The thing Boral hated. The thing Theron despised. The thing that was quintessentially her. Her eyes darted around the room, desperately searching for a solution, a weapon, an override, anything. And then her gaze fell on the thick legacy conduit, snaking from the control pattern into the wall. The same kind of conduit from the maintenance tunnels. And where there was a conduit, there was a port. A dusty old architect data port right on the side of the main console. An idea sparked in her mind. It was stupid. It was insane. It was an inelegant, brute force, chaotic solution. It was perfect. The engine is designed for order, she whispered, her own voice sounding foreign and distant. It processes logical threats. She scrambled to her feet, ignoring Boral as he advanced. She fumbled at her belt, pulling out her personal data slate, a battered, cheap model covered in stickers and her favorite punk bands. She ran to the console, to that forgotten, obsolete port. Laziness is universal, she grunted, jamming the slate's connector into the port. It fit, a perfect, sloppy fit. She bypassed the security handshake and opened a direct data stream, flooding the ancient, orderly architect system with the most disorderly, chaotic, and illogical data she possessed. Her entire music library, 300 gigabytes of screeching, hyperpunk, dissonant noise rock, and thrash metal. Her collection of terrible, angst-ridden poetry she'd written when she was 16. Every contradictory philosophical text she had ever downloaded, from nihilism to absurdism. And for good measure, the entire unedited audio recording of her last screaming match with Theron. The stasis engine was a masterpiece of logical engineering. It was designed to analyze threats, identify chaotic variables, and broadcast a counter frequency to nullify them. It was built to process dissent, aggression, and tactical unpredictability. Its design, however, had no answer for a song called Sentient Buzzsaw by the Exploding Cornflakes. It was hit with a tidal wave of pure, unadulterated human chaos. The engine's internal logic, programmed for consensus and order, tried to find a pattern in the noise. It tried to parse the grammatical structure of her poetry and found none. It attempted to reconcile the conflicting arguments of a dozen human philosophers arguing about the meaning of nothing. It tried to find the correct debater in her argument with Theron and nearly melted its own logic cores. The humming of the great machine sputtered. The smooth green light flickered, corrupted by flashes of angry, static-filled red. What is this optimal counter-frequency for? A guitar solo? The ancient machine seemed to ask itself. Query, define irony. Cascade failure in emotional logic subordinates. The humming became a grinding, stuttering shriek. The engine was trying to find a stable order in a face of weaponized nonsense, and it was tying itself into an ever-tightening knot of logical contradictions. With a final, deafening scream of shearing metal and frying circuits, the stasis engine powered down. The green light died, plunging the chamber into a dim glow of the emergency lights. The mental pressure vanished, replaced by the ringing in Ray's ears. Boral, who had been striding toward her like a god, froze. The wavering field around him collapsed. Cut off from his power source, his strength vanished. He slumped to the ground, a mountain defeated, not by a bigger mountain, but by a handful of gravel thrown into its gears. Defeated. Boral was in custody, babbling about the sanctity of order to a very unimpressed coalition security team. The Galactic Council, once they were briefed, was simultaneously horrified by the threat of the stasis engine and utterly fascinated by Ray's solution. She received a formal commendation for innovative strategic application of unconventional cultural data. In layman's terms, she saved the galaxy with bad music. Humanity's place on the galactic stage was quietly solidified, not as honorable warriors, but as essential, unpredictable agents of chaos, a necessary bug in the galactic code. Back in the dorm room, it was quiet, the kind of real, peaceful quiet Ray had been craving for months. She was sprawled on her bunk, boots and all, ready for a well-deserved nap that she hoped would last for at least a week. Theron was on his side of the room. Instead of studying, he was cleaning, meticulously wiping down every surface, restoring his space to its pristine, orderly state. But there was a difference. The action lacked its former hostility. It was simply him. He paused, holding a dust cloth, and looked over at the chaotic mess of her side of the room, at her data slate, which was still sitting on her nightstand. I have analyzed the contents of the data you deployed against the stasis engine, he said, his voice as dry as desert sand. Initial projection suggests that repeated long-term exposure to your music library could be classified as a Class 6 psychological weapon under the Coalition Accords. Ray opened one eye. A genuine smile, small and tired, cracked the cynical mask on her face. Yeah, just wait till you hear my Christmas playlist. She thought she saw the corner of his mouth twitch, the faintest hint of a smile, before he turned back to his cleaning. The steady, faint light from his skin caught the curve of his cheek, and for the first time, Ray thought it looked less like a cold light of a distant star and more like something warm, something soft. The victory was won. The galaxy was safe. And an unbreakable, unspoken partnership had just begun. Ray Mercer closed her eyes. She was finally going to get that damn nap.